Rob decreed that Tuesday, May 7th would be a rest day, so we got up late and sat around Camp 2, buzzing with nervous anticipation over the imminent summit assault. I fiddled with my crampons and some other gear, then tried to read a Carl Hiaasen paperback, but was so focused on the climb that I kept scanning the same sentences over and over without the words registering. Eventually I put the book down, snapped a few photos of Doug posing with a flag the Kent school kids had asked him to carry up the peak, and pumped him for detailed information about the difficulties of the summit pyramid, which he remembered well from the year before. "By the time we get to the top," he frowned, "I guarantee that you're gonna be one hurtin' homber." Doug was hell-bent on joining the summit push, even though his throat was still bothering him and his strength seemed to be at a low ebb. As he put it, "I've put too much of myself into this mountain to quit now without giving it everything I've got." Late that afternoon, Fisher walked through our camp with a clenched jaw, moving uncharacteristically slowly toward his own tents. He usually managed to maintain a relentlessly upbeat attitude. One of his favorite utterances was, "If you're bumming out, you're not going to get to the top, so as long as we're up here, we might as well make a point of grooving." At the moment, however, Scott did not appear to be grooving in the slightest. Instead, he looked anxious and extremely tired, because he'd encouraged his clients to move up and down the mountain independently during the acclimatization period. He ended up having to make a number of hurried, unplanned excursions between base camp and the upper camps when several clients experienced problems and needed to be escorted down. He'd already made special trips to assist Tim Madsen, Pete Schoening, and Dale Cruz. And now, on what should have been a badly needed day and a half of rest, Fisher had just been forced to make a hasty round trip from Camp 2 to base camp and back to help his good friend Cruz after he came down with what appeared to be a relapse of haste. Fisher had arrived at Camp 2 around noon the previous day, just after Andy and me, having climbed from base camp well ahead of his clients. He'd directed guide Anatoly Bukreev to bring up the rear, stay close to the group, and keep an eye on everybody. But Bukreev ignored Fisher's instructions. Instead of climbing with the team, he slept late, took a shower, and departed base camp some 5 hours behind the last of the clients. Thus, when Cruz collapsed at 20,000 feet with a splitting headache, Bukreev was nowhere in the vicinity, compelling Fisher and Beidelman to rush down from Camp 2 to handle the emergency as soon as word of Cruz's condition arrived via climbers coming up the western Coombe. Not long after Fisher reached Cruz and began the troublesome descent to base camp, they encountered Bukreev at the top of the icefall, ascending alone, and Fisher harshly reprimanded the guide for shirking his responsibilities. "Yeah," Cruz remembers, "Scott laid into Tolley pretty good. He wanted to know why he was so far behind everybody, why he wasn't climbing with the team." According to Cruz and other clients of Fisher's, tension between Fisher and Bukreev had been building throughout the expedition. Fisher paid Bukreev $25,000, an unusually generous fee for guiding Everest. Most other guides on the mountain were paid $10,000 to $15,000. Skilled climbing Sherpas received only $1,400 to $2,500, and Bukreev's performance hadn't been meeting his expectations. Tolley was very strong and a very good technical climber, Cruz explains, but he had poor social skills. He didn't watch out for other people. He just wasn't a team player. Earlier, I'd told Scott that I didn't want to have to climb with Tolley high on the mountain, because I doubted that I'd be able to count on him when it really mattered. The underlying problem was that Bukreev's notion of his responsibilities differed substantially from Fisher's. As a Russian, Bukreev came from a tough, proud, hard-scrabble climbing culture that did not believe in coddling the weak. In Eastern Europe, guides were trained to act more like Sherpas, hauling loads, fixing ropes, establishing the route, and less like caretakers. Tall and blonde, with handsome Slavic features, Bukreev was one of the most accomplished high-altitude climbers in the world, with 20 years of experience in the Himalaya, including 2 ascents of Everest without supplemental oxygen. and in the course of his distinguished career, he'd formulated a number of unorthodox, very strongly held opinions about how the mountain should be ascended. He was quite outspoken in his belief that it was a mistake for guides to pamper their clients. If client cannot climb Everest without big help from guide, Boukreev told me, this client should not be on Everest. Otherwise, there can be big problems up high. But Boukreev's refusal or inability to play the role of a conventional guide in the Western tradition exasperated Fisher. It also forced him and Beidelman to shoulder a disproportionate share of the caretaker duties for their group. And by the first week in May, the effort had taken an unmistakable toll on Fisher's health. After arriving in base camp with the ailing crews on the evening of May 6th, Fisher made 2 satellite phone calls to Seattle in which he complained bitterly to his business partner, Karen Dickinson, and to his publicist, Jane Brome, about Boukreev's intransigence. Neither woman imagined that these would be the last conversations they would ever have with Fisher.